Yeah, look, I mean, this happened 20 years ago in Texas. The circumstances are a little bit different, but there's no prohibition on mid-decade redistricting in Texas. And so
Hmm.
back in 2003, after Republicans took control of state government, they redrew the previous map, which was sort of a version of it was a court-drawn map, but it was kind of really a Democratic gerrymander. This time, Republicans in Texas would be modifying their own gerrymander from earlier this decade. That produced a 25-13 Republican advantage in the congressional delegation. But following the 2024 election and with the White House leaning on them, it seems possible that they can draw additional seats. And I think it looks like they're going to try. And then it's a question of what does the map look like and what's the environment next year, and do they actually realize the gains that they'd be drawing for themselves on paper?
Well, Texas is our big example here, but when you add a couple of other states, is this actually a strategy to maintain control of the House?
Yeah, it looks like it. I mean, Ohio, we already knew was going to have to draw new maps. Ohio is a very convoluted redistricting system, and the map that's currently in place was only designed or was only allowed to be in effect for two election cycles, 2022 and 2024. Republicans are basically going to have more power over the process than they did back in 2021 and 2022. Ohio has a 10-5 Republican House delegation right now. It's possible that maybe the Republicans could get that up to 12 or even 13-2. And so that's another state to watch. You know, it's possible that other states could try to reopen redistricting. Some Democrats are thinking about trying to do that, although it's harder in those states because a lot of the states where Democrats have control of state government also has some sort of restrictions on gerrymandering or an independent commission that draws the lines. You know, Texas doesn't have that, and so it's just easy for Republicans to just reopen it in Texas. It's a lot harder in a state like California, for instance.
Let's talk about California, because Governor Gavin Newsom is always waiting in the wings here. Kyle, at a moment like this, he says California, in fact, should try to counter states like Texas by redrawing its own congressional districts. Listen to what the governor said.
When Donald Trump calls in to the Texas legislature along the lines of the phone calls he made saying, find me some votes in Georgia, and says, find me 5 more seats in Texas, they're playing by a different set of rules. They can't win by the traditional game, so they want to change the game. We can act holier than thou. We could sit on the sidelines, talk about the way the world should be. Or we can recognize the existential nature that is this moment.
Let's not talk about the way the world should be. Let's talk about the way it is. In 2010, voters in California approved a measure that put the job, to your point, of drawing California's congressional map into the hands of an independent commission. So what's Gavin Newsom talking about?
Well, look, I mean, it looks like California is thinking about trying to maybe go back to the voters to ask them to grant an exception. You also could maybe make a reading of California law and say that, you know, at the start of the decade, the maps are drawn by a commission, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about the middle of the decade. Again, all this stuff would end up in court if attempted.
Yes.
Republicans assert that even though Democrats have, you know, that's an independent commission in California, that is still a Democratic leaning map. And there may be some truth to that, but I think it's also true that California could have an even more lopsided delegation than it already is. It's 43-9 Democratic right now, but you could potentially draw a map where the Democrats could get an extra, you know, several number of seats out of California. But the thing is there are many more hoops to jump through for Gavin Newsom and Democrats in California than there are for Governor Greg Abbott and Republicans in Texas.
Mm-hmm. You just said something important, Kyle, and that's court. That's where all this is going, right?
Oh, yeah, I would assume there's already an active lawsuit by Democrats and their allies over the Texas map, and there surely will be again. But, you know, these cases take forever to get sorted out. So even if there was some sort of, you know, strong legal argument to be made against the maps, maybe that isn't determined until 2028. And, you know, the White House pretty clearly is looking at this and saying, hey, how can we maximize as Republicans our chance of keeping the House in 2026, which is Trump's last midterm because he's constitutionally forbidden from running for office again in 2028. And all these moves are designed toward that goal.
Remember that vote in California 15 years ago as Arnold Schwarzenegger urged voters to terminate gerrymandering. The New York Times reminds us of this in the story that they wrote up on it. Gerrymandering has been blamed for the partisan political world that we now live in. Kyle, not to get too big picture, but this is the root of our partisan evil, is it not?
I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, I do think that, I mean, in an ideal world, I think that, Congress would create rules for redistricting that was sort of fair between the states. But the thing is that what your definition of fair might be and what my definition of fair might be could potentially differ. I will say that you do have a situation where a lot of members are in safe seats. Even in, one of the things in gerrymandering is and this is what the current Texas map really is that you have a bunch of safe Republican seats and then you have a smaller number of safe Democratic seats to the point where very few of the actual districts are competitive in general elections. And that does maybe make members a little bit more, reliant on primary voters and appealing to them as opposed to general election swing voters. But even if you had the, criteria for nonpartisan redistricting, you'd still have a bunch of safe seats. So, I think there's a lot of other things at play beyond gerrymandering, even though I think we could sort of agree that, drawing partisan lines for your own party's benefit, that's not something that's particularly appealing.
Kyle Kondik, we just spent better part of 3 months talking about cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP, cuts to food stamps. And we've seen some pretty chippy town halls leading to the conventional wisdom that in an off year, it might be even more difficult for the party in power to maintain control of Capitol Hill, the House, and maybe even in this case, the Senate. What are you seeing as the ground shifts beneath our feet here and the impact that the president's big, beautiful bill will have on the midterm elections?
Look, it's an unpopular piece of legislation. I think at the very best, Republicans, won't suffer because of it. And I think it's possible they will suffer because of it. It's hard to find examples from history of, a party passing a big kind of one party piece of legislation and then, benefiting from it in the next election, in the next midterm. I think we've seen throughout 2025 that there's been, a handful of special elections here and there. And it kind of feels like 2017 did in that, the Democrats are sort of more engaged, that there was sort of the usual forces kind of working against the White House party. I think what's interesting about this potential gerrymander in Texas and some of the ripple effects of it is that it would open the possibility that there could, in fact, be a big wave against the Republicans next year, and that, for the Democrats to win the House popular vote by several points, but Republicans might still be able to hold on the House because of new gerrymanders. So that throws the House, I think, into a little bit more uncertainty.
This is why this could be fun stuff to talk about this far out. We've only got a minute left, Kyle, but I'm curious if we should be reading into fundraising yet. The NRCC outraising the DCCC in June and for all of the second quarter. Does the money matter in a world of politics like this?
I do think it matters on the margins, although, we've seen plenty of instances in recent years where, one side has a big money advantage and doesn't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily produce a victory for them. I think that, one of the things we've seen with Democrats, I think, is that, some of their fundraising may tick up, particularly as they get nominees in some of these districts that they're trying to challenge in. I think Republicans can be perfectly happy with the start they're off to in terms of fundraising. But again, I don't necessarily know if it's predictive one way or the other.